So the way I look at the 23 candidates plus David Duke field is this. If you are a minor candidate, it becomes exponentially tougher for you to break through because you have a very crowded ballot now. And let's face it, a lot of times in these crowded races, you have a lot of people who, in my opinion, are not serious candidates, number one. Number two, you have candidates who start saying the same thing as what the other guy does. So unless you have a couple $1 billion, I think it's going to be very hard to break through if your name is not David Duke. Now, I'll briefly address the Duke factor before I get to the other parts of the race. Okay. So David Duke, what his role in this race is going to be is sucking all the oxygen out of the race from all those other minor candidates. I see him as more of a 5 to 10% candidate, meaning he can't make the runoff, but he can sure wreck a couple people's careers if they're trying to ascend into that second or third tier to be a viable candidate. Now, okay. With regard, so that's kind of my take on David Duke. Now, one thing that I think is fueling the hurricane, so to speak, with David Duke is that the Republicans are making the mistake of making him a victim. In other words, going through all these motions of censoring him and denouncing him and this and that. The more effective tactic I've seen going all the way back to 1988 is not to give him the oxygen he deserves. For instance, I remember there was an incident I was reading in Tyler Bridges' book. He was talking about the 1988 race where Duke was running for president. And not only did Democrats not give him debate time, but they fought to keep him off the ballot. And basically he was a non-entity there. And the Republicans cannot give him, I don't see him being able to run a full-fledged campaign like he might have in 90 or 91. But if you give him a lot of attention and create sympathy for him, I could see him closer to 10% than 5%. Because the thing, too, he's not been in electoral politics in a couple of decades. So some of the shine has come off of that luster, in addition to the fact that you have a new generation of people who come along who don't really know who David Duke was. Right. Well, I'll give you a different take. Okay. So there's certainly the past he has, and the fact that when he made his announcement, he was certainly not shy about going there with regards to his feelings about Jewish people. That is one of those things. It has been eerily consistent in every utterance he's made for the last few decades, is his obsession over Jewish people. But there's another aspect to this race that politicians are not covering that I think, to me, would be a more appropriate talking point, and that is he's been going around the world and so forth. What has his Louisiana presence really been? Is he even a registered Louisiana voter? I mean, I'm sure he is now, but in other words, he's been going out to Russia and all these other countries and not really been staying around Louisiana and doing Louisiana things. You'll remember a generation, well, actually about a decade ago, when John Burrow was about to run for governor, there was one little minor nagging problem he had, and that was he was a Maryland and not a Louisiana voter. Yeah. And my perception is the thought of his residency being challenged and it possibly being an upheld challenge was kind of what caused him to put the brakes on the gubernatorial bid.
Sure it was.
So, in other words, there were other tangible factors. There were other factors out there that I think are applicable to Duke, given that he has been abroad and has been doing things in other countries. So just a different angle, I think, that ought to be explored, because I think that there's people there who, they're going to support him regardless of what he does. And that, to me, becomes an unmovable vote.
Yeah.
$10 or $1 million on media. So what my closing thoughts would be about the Senate race, just to encapsulate, is pretty much what I have thought before. And I have done some polling. I'll be general and just say I have done some polling. I see that on the Democratic side, Foster Campbell has the stronger, infrastructure than Caroline Fayard or Josh Perlin do. On the Republican side, the congressman and John Kennedy I see as the front runners. And the congressman, of course, I'm referring to Congressman John Fleming and Congressman Charles Boustany. Both of them I see as strong candidates, as well as Kennedy. Since Kennedy is perceived as the top dog right now, obviously, at some point, his competitor is going to go after him because that's what competitors who are not finishing in first or second place do. Then, of course, you have everybody else who's going to crowd the field up. And when you have a crowded field like that, one thing which I do think is worth small percentages of a vote are ballot placement. So if we're to, and Jeremy Alford touched upon this last week, if you were to look at who shows up first in the ballot, you see technically the first name is Beryl Billiot of Amite. So that might be worth 1% more than Beryl would have gotten otherwise. And Charles Bustani and Foster Campbell of the major candidates show up first. That is a challenge that the other candidates are going to have to face in a 24-candidate ballot where you're also going to have, depending on what part of the state you're living in, Congress, PSC, some local races, amendments, tax propositions, et cetera, et cetera. You have a very crowded ballot. Oh, and then, of course, you have president up top. A very crowded ballot with 24 candidates in the Senate race. So in other words, people are going to have to make quick decisions about who they're for or against in the Senate race. So if you're one of those candidates, probably the, nearly 17 to 20 who are not going to be serious contenders, your life is a lot harder because David Duke is just taking your oxygen away. So that's kind of how I see is the Senate race unfolding. It will be interesting to see how the TV ads start, the tenor of the TV ads, who's attacking whom, and so forth. So all that to me is what I see as the context for the Senate race.